We have now considered the main tenets of Berkeley's idealism and anti-materialism. Berkeley rejects empirically unsupported speculation that the sensible properties of sensible things are upheld by insensible material substrata, and the conclusion of that sensible things are mere congeries of ideas lacking any underlying material substance as their metaphysical foundation. Berkeley's philosophy is so unusual, and it has been the subject of so much misunderstanding that is necessary to clarify his position before considering his arguments in order to avoid distortions. It is appropriate to recount the chain of reasoning by which Berkeley proposes to deny the existence of insensible, unthinking matter and to defend the existence of God and the concept of sensible things as congeries of ideas. Philoneus first requires Hylas to explain the nature of sensible things. He elicits from Hylas an important concession, a point with which Berkeley also firmly agrees that sensible things are immediately perceived by sensation. This may seem like an obvious enough assumption, but it turns out to have crucial implication for Philoneus's conclusion that sensible things are congeries of ideas existing only in the mind, with no underlying material substratum. It follows, as a consequence of this proposition, that sensible things are immediately perceived by sense, that we do not see stars, but bright pinpoints of colors, that we do not hear carriages in the streets, but rather characteristic sounds that we associate with moving carriages. Hylas admits this point in page 110. It seems then that by sensible things you mean those only which can be perceived immediately by sense. Right. Doth it not follow from these I that though I see one part of the sky red and another blue, and that my reason doth hence evidently conclude there must be some cause of that diversity of colors, yet that cause cannot be said to be a sensible thing or perceived by the sense of seeing? It doth, he says, and we can jump. To prevent any more questions of this kind, I tell you once for all that by sensible things I mean those only which are perceived by sense, and that in truth the sense perceive nothing which they do not perceive immediately, for they make no inferences. The deducing therefore of causes or occasions from effects and appearances, which alone are perceived by sense, entirely relates to reason. It seems reasonable to say, as Hylas and Philoneus agree, that the senses make no inferences. This is especially true if we agree with Berkeley's widely held 18th century belief that sensation is passive, receiving only such data as are made available to it and incapable of reasoning, whereas judgment is active and capable of inference. If sensation is passive, then sensation considered in itself cannot deduce the existence of any of the causes of sensible qualities, but can at most possibly perceive whatever sensible qualities are presented immediately to it without inferring their causes. The implication is that sensible things are immediately directly experienced in sensation, rather than inferred from what is sensed as the causes of sensation. Hylas's and Philoneus's agreement on this point can be understood as a clarification of what it means for something to be sensible, to be a sensible thing. given the concept of sensation and of what it means to be a sensible thing. With this preliminary admission in hand, Philonous proceeds to offer one of his most important demonstrations. He proposes to show that sensible things exist only as congeries in the mind. Although Berkeley does not mention any particular source of flame, it is convenient to think of his example in this section of the first dialogue as Berkeley's candle. The argument takes this form. Hylas and Philonous agree that heat is a sensible thing, but Hylas at first insists, even in the case of heat, that there is a difference between existing and being perceived. Let's read this one in color blue in front of you now. Heat then is a sensible thing, certainly, says Hylas. That the reality of sensible things consists in being perceived? Or is it something distinct from their being perceived and that bears no relation to the mind? To exist is one thing, and to be perceived is another. Philonous explains, I speak with regard to sensible things only, and of this I ask, whether by the real existence you mean a subsistence exterior to the mind and distinct from their being perceived. Hylas replies, I mean a real thing, absolutely. I mean a real absolute being, distinct from and without any relation to their being perceived. Heat, therefore, he says, if it be allowed, a real being must exist without the mind. It must. Hylas articulates the materialist position that Philonous rejects. Philonous holds that if heat is a sensible thing that exists in objects outside of the mind, then it must do so regardless of its exact degree. Whether it is merely warm or burning hot, Hylas agrees. Philonous explains. Tell me, Hylas, is this real existence equally compatible to all degrees of heat which we perceive, or is there any reason why we should attribute it to some and deny it others? And if there be, pray let me know that reason. Hylas explains, whatever degree of heat we perceive by sense, we may be sure the same exists in the object that occasions it. Hylas asks, what? The greatest as well as the least? Hylas grants the assumption of Philonous's rhetorical question. This is all that Philonous needs in order to close the jaws of his trap on the materialist thesis. He is ready to reveal an absurdity in the belief that sensible things as immediately perceived in the sense experience nevertheless exist outside the mind. Hylas continues to claim that to exist is one thing and to be perceived is another. We read further in 112, and beginning here. Here, Philonous leads Hylas to question the assumption that heat in particular exists independently of the mind that perceives it. He poses a series of questions in which he gets Hylas to admit that there is no discernible difference between great heat and pain, and that pain undoubtedly exists in the mind. Wherever great heat exists, it must exist in the same place as the pain that is indistinguishable from it. Since the sensation of pain is evidently something mental, it does not exist outside the mind in the candle flame as a material substance. If great heat is indistinguishable from pain, then they must exist together wherever that turns out to be. If pain is mental, then great heat must also be mental, existing as pain within the mind. Nor is there an important difference in principle, as Hylas admits, between great heat and heat of any lesser degree. It follows If what has gone before is correct, that heat as a sensible thing exists only in the mind, Hylas and Philinus arrive step by step at the idealist conclusion, and let's read this. But it's not most, and it's in purple in front of you now. But it's not the most vehement and intense degree of heat, a very great pain. No one can deny it, Hylas says. And in any unperceiving thing capable of pain or pleasure, no, certainly. Is your material substance a senseless being or a being endowed with sense and perception? It is senseless, without doubt. It cannot therefore be the subject of pain, by no means, says Hylas. Philinus continues, nor consequently of the greatest heat perceived by sense, since you acknowledge this to be no small pain. I grant it. Philinus explains, what shall we then of your external, what shall we say then of your external object? Is it material substance or no? Hynas explains, it is a material substance with the sensible qualities inhering in it. How then can a great heat exist in it, since you own it, cannot in a material substance? I desire you would clear this point. Hylas explains, hold, Philinus. I fear I was out in yielding intense heat to be a pain. It should seem rather that pain is something distinct from heat, and the consequence or effect of it. Philinus explains again, upon putting your hand near the fire, do you perceive one simple uniform sensation or two distinct sensations? Hylas would say, but one simple sensation. Is not the heat immediately perceived? It is. And the pain? True. Then Philinus explains, seeing therefore they are both immediately perceived at the same time, and the fire affects you only with one simple and uncompounded idea, it follows that this same simple idea is both the intense heat immediately perceived and the pain, and consequently that the intense heat immediately perceived is nothing distinct from a particular sort of pain. It seems so, says Hylas. Philinus, of course, begins to break the hold that the materialist way of thinking about the existence of and perception of sensible things has had on Hylas. In the case of intense heat and the pain produced in touching a flame, Philinus maintains, and Hylas is finally compelled to yield, that there is a sensible thing that exists only in the mind. If Hylas had assumed that no sensible thing exists entirely within the mind, or that there's always a difference between a sensible thing's existing and its being perceived, then Philinus has at least succeeded in disabusing him of his materialist assumption. Philinus follows up the heat pain argument with a similar illustration from Locke's essay concerning human understanding, 1700s. The example is meant to show that the sensible qualities do not always exist independently of sensation, but are sometimes a function of preconditioning. Philinus relies on Hylas's knowledge of a very common experience, and we see that in page 115 of this text here. Suppose now, and it's now in color green in front of you. Suppose now one of your hands hot and the other cold, and that they are both at once put into the same vessel of water in an intermediate state. Will not the water seem cold unto one hand and warm to the other? It will, says Hylas. Ought we not therefore by your principles to conclude it is really both cold and warm at the same time, that is according to your own concession to believe an absurdity? Hylas explains and answers, I confess it seems so. By preparing the same person's two hands, placing one in hot water and the other in cold, and then plunging them into the same vessel of lukewarm water, the heated hand, as we can easily verify for ourselves, will feel cool and the chilled hand will feel warm. If the heat of the lukewarm water cannot be regarded as belonging outside the mind, in the water as a mind-independent material substance, then it must belong instead to the mind. At least this must be true if, as Hylas also believes, the same external things, such as water in a bowl, cannot simultaneously uniformly possess the contrary properties of being both warm and cool. The warmth and coolness, Philonoos conclude, must instead reside in the subject's mind as distinct ideas of the same thing. Philonoos generalizes the conclusion, arguing that it applies to other sensations produced by other kinds of interactions, and we can find that in the latter part of this page. Here now, in color green, in front of you. When a pin pricks your finger, doth it not rend and divide the fibers of your flesh? It doth. And when a coal burns your finger, doth it any more? It doth not. Since therefore you neither judge the sensation itself occasioned by the pin, nor anything like it to be in the pin, you should not conformably to what you have now granted, judge the sensation occasioned by the fire, or anything like it to be in the fire. Well, since it must be so, I am content to yield this point and acknowledge that heat and cold are only sensations existing in our minds, but there still remains qualities enough to secure the reality of external things. While Philonoos, by means of these examples, may have opened the door to counterexamples to the general materialist thesis that all sensible things exist outside the mind, and that there's always a distinction between the existence and perception of a sensible thing, it's not clear that Hylas must admit that the conclusion holds in every case. Hylas indicates in his final remark that although he grudgingly grants the idealist anti-materialist conclusion in the case of such sensible qualities as heat and cold, the candle flame and the basin of water, he still believes that there are other sensible qualities existing outside the mind in external, material, or mind-independent things. Hylas retreats to a distinction between types of qualities made famous by Galileo, Locke, and others. The distinction between primary and secondary qualities marks a difference between qualities of things that seem to be subjective or conditioned by the individuals who perceive something on the one hand, and qualities that appear to be more objective that obtains if they obtain at all regardless of the condition of the perceived subject. We begin by giving a rough idea of how the distinction is supposed to divide properties into two categories. Secondary qualities are supposed to include colors, tastes, smells, feels, and sounds, whereas primary qualities are meant to classify extension of size, figure, shape, gravity, weight, motion, mass, and the like. We can see that the category of primary qualities includes the sort of properties that are studied in the natural sciences such as physics, whereas the secondary qualities seems to be more readily included as topics for psychology. Locke indeed proposes to distinguish physics and psychology precisely on the basis of the distinction, respectively, between primary and secondary qualities. We tend to think of secondary qualities as subjective variable in the same way as Locke's example of the hot and cold hands submerged in lukewarm water. We know, for example, that some persons see colors differently than others, that they are what is called colorblind, and that some persons perceive tastes and smells and other properties different than others. Hylas has now been forced to admit that heat and cold, the degree of warmth or lack thereof, that sensible things appear to the senses to possess, exist within the mind rather than externally on or mind independently in an externally material world. He digs in his heels and tries to preserve at least a modified version of the materialist thesis. He clings to the possibility of some properties of sensible things existing outside the mind. If there's such a thing, properties of things, then sensible things are not merely constituted as ideas within the mind. Hylas adapts the distinction between primary and secondary qualities to this purpose and grants Philonoos only the conclusion that secondary qualities are mind independent. or mind-dependent, while continuing to insist that primary qualities exist independently of thought. Hylas proposes to qualify the concept of heat and cold as experienced by a subject, in contrast with heat and cold as existing externally in sensible things. Philonous correctly resists this dodge, on the grounds that it goes against Hylas's previous admission that sensible things are immediately experienced by sensation. It is it is the difference again between what is possibly perceived as ideas and what is inferred about the causes of ideas. Their discussion proceeds in this way as they continue agreeing to disagree. Let's read this one in page 117. It's in color green in front of you. Hold, Philonous. I now see what it was deluded me all this time. You ask whether heat and cold, sweetness and bitterness were not particular sorts of pleasure and pain, to which I answered simply that they were, whereas I should have thus distinguished those qualities as perceived by us are pleasures or pains, but not as existing in the external objects. We must not therefore conclude absolutely that there's no heat in the fire or sweetness in the sugar, but only that heat or sweetness as perceived by us are not in the fire or sugar. What say you to this? I say it's nothing to the purpose. Our discourse proceeded altogether concerning sensible things, which you define to be the things we immediately perceive by our senses. Whatever other qualities, therefore, you speak of as distinct from these, I know nothing of them. Neither do they at all belong to the point in dispute. Hylas takes the necessary further step, explicitly introducing the distinction between primary and secondary qualities when he interestingly declares here on page 125 there. It's in color green in front of you. I frankly own Philonous that it is in vain to stand out any longer. Colors, sounds, tastes, in a word, all those termed secondary qualities have certainly no existence without the mind. But by this acknowledgement, I must not be supposed to, to derogate anything from the reality of matter or external objects, seeing it is no more than several philosophers maintain, who nevertheless are the farthest imaginable from denying matter. For the clearer understanding of these, you must know sensible qualities are by philosophers divided into primary and secondary. The former are extension, figure, solidity, gravity, motion, and the rest. And these they hold exist really in bodies. The latter are those above enumerated, or briefly, all sensible qualities beside the primary, which they assert are only so many sensations of ideas existing nowhere but in the mind. But all this I doubt not, you are already apprised of. For my part, I have been a long time sensible, there was such an opinion current among philosophers, but was never thoroughly convinced of its truth, until now. The distinction between primary and secondary qualities lends Hylas's position the authority of scientific philosophy from the work of Galileo and Locke. It enables Hylas to grant Philonous' conclusion about the properties of the candle in its original form concerning the perception of heat. At the same time, Hylas's use of the distinction implies that at least some kinds of properties of sensible things exist outside the mind and independently of thought. The difference between the subjectivity in experience of secondary qualities and the objectivity of primary qualities is seen even in Philonous' example involving the fire Berkeley scandal, and Lux Basin. Before I continue, if you haven't subscribed, shared, like, or followed this YouTube channel, Samo't sa Simula, please do so to keep this work ongoing. Thank you. And to continue, if we distinguish between warmth as a subjective secondary quality of feeling and temperature as an objective primary quality involving the speed of molecular motion in the candle flame and the lukewarm water bath, then we can hold both that warmth exists in the mind while insisting that temperature exists outside the mind. We expect to be able to obtain objective information about temperature that is not directly associated with the experience of pain or the variable sensation of coolness or warmth to hot and cold hands by checking the objects with a non-thinking instrument such as a thermometer. A thermometer provides an ambivalent reading with no feeling and no subjective variability. We need only to look at the scale of the thermometer to know what objective temperature the candle flame or vessel of water has, regardless of whatever subjective sensation or warmth are experienced. Philonoos, however, is not deterred by Hylas's maneuver, but meets the objection by arguing that in the end, there is really no difference between primary and secondary qualities. Thank you for listening.